Hi everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on how to guide to launch a successful competitive mobile game. My name is Evan James. I'm really excited to have you guys on this webinar. We're going to cover a lot of great topics and really want to leave you with some key takeaways on what it takes to really launch a successful game, what are some of the key tricks and best practices for developing a game, for getting a game live, and to really driving users into your game. A couple things before we get started, just so everybody is aware here. But the webinar will run for 40 minutes. We'll be talking through a number of different topics related to guiding a launch of a successful game. And then we'll have a 10-minute Q&A session. So if you have any questions during that time, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. A few things to note. All participants are muted throughout the duration of the presentation. This is just to ensure the best audio quality for all. It's not that we wouldn't love to hear your lovely voices. During the presentation, if you encounter any audio issues, just try refreshing your browser and checking your computer's audio settings. One thing that I frequently find is that is the main issue if you are having any audio. So do try that. If that still persists and there's an audio problem, then go ahead and raise your hand or submit something into the chat box, and one of us will respond to you. Again, during any time throughout the webinar, feel free to submit questions into the chat button. We will be taking those questions at the end of the presentation. And lastly, no need to chat about whether we are going to record today's webinar and whether we're going to share it out. We absolutely will. So you'll have the opportunity to follow up, listen to it again, and hopefully share it with others that are interested. So before we get started, I would like to just take a quick poll of the crowd to see if you have a competitive mobile game that you're thinking about turning into an esport. So if you want to go ahead and just take a few minutes to enter in yes or no, but I'm developing one, or no, but I'm considering it. And then we'll close out the results. Awesome. So from what I can see, it looks like 37% of you are saying yes, you are considering or have a competitive mobile game that you're thinking of turning into an esport. 18% of you are currently developing one, and 43% of you guys are considering it. So that's kind of a great wide range across the board. So we're going to talk through, for the people that are yes, we'll talk through some of the key things that you should know. For the ones that are developing it, this is an excellent time to tune into the webinar, as you'll be able to understand some of the best tips for actually creating the most relevant gameplay, the genre that you should be looking at. And for those that are considering it, hopefully we can talk through just some of the things of what are the pros and other things to think about when developing an esport. So we'll talk through that a little bit. So before getting started, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Evan James. I'm the head of product marketing here. One of the things that really excites me about working at Skillz and being at Skillz is I've played mobile games for a number of years, but never really considered myself to be a gamer. I don't own a console. I don't play anything on a desktop, but I do play mobile games. And when I discovered Skillz, I really realized that my competitive nature worked perfectly for a mobile game. So I've been really excited and happy to be here since being at Skillz, because I'm getting to see everything from a hands-on perspective. And have really kind of understood what it is that drives me to play a competitive mobile game. So I've had that cool kind of player experience, and I get to help all of you guys really be able to create the best game that will invoke some of my psychological decisions for playing a game. In addition to myself, we also have Kevin Perkins, who's our product specialist here. He's going to talk through a number of things, but I'll turn over to him to introduce himself.
Hey everybody, my name is Kevin Perkins. I am a product specialist here that works specifically to make features and developments for our developer console, which is where, if you're not familiar with it, all of our developers go to bring their games onto the Skillz platform. And I'm really excited to talk to you all today and not only share some of the best tips and tricks that I've learned over my time here over the past year, but also to understand some thoughts and get some feedback and actually share some awesome new features that we're going to be coming out with. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys today and share this information.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. Very happy to have you on. So jumping right into it, the first thing is what makes for a competitive sport. If you think about history over time, there are a number of different kind of key sports that have existed forever. If you think of wrestling, wrestling has been around since the days of the Romans and Greeks. And there are a couple of key things when thinking about what goes into having a competitive sport. One is that you need to have players. So you need to have players that are willing to participate in that sport, and there needs to be a set of rules that players adhere to with an objective of how are you going to actually win the game. So those are kind of two key things that definitely play into having competitive sport. In addition to having the rules, you need somebody to enforce those rules. So you need to have some sort of referee. It wouldn't be fun whatsoever to have a sport where there's an objective, but anybody can do anything to get to that final objective. It just kind of takes away from that competitive spirit, and fairness is another kind of key element to that. In some sports, you need to, it can be an individual sport or it can also be a team sport. So how do players come together and compete as a team to have a common objective? And these are just kind of like key things that really make up what is a competitive sport. But some of the other things that you just want to really kind of think about is the gameplay consistent, and is it something that still brings fun to every player over time? If you think about golf, for instance, golf has consistent rules in that you're able to you're trying to get the lowest score on each hole, and there's a total of 18 holes in most standard golf tournaments. The gameplay or the game match does vary from one course to another, so it's not necessarily that it's the same court as you would have in a basketball or a football field, but you do still have those same objectives, and you still have those players trying to compete to get the lowest score. So there's some form of consistent gameplay that is still interesting for viewers to watch, still interesting for players to compete in, and this is what really kind of brings about having that kind of competitive sport. And then when you think of different types of sports tournaments, if we're going with that same same golf example, there are different categories of different competitions. So starting at the bottom there, you'll see casual competition, where you're playing for the thrill of it. I personally am going out on Saturday to play at the Presidio Public Golf Course. There are green fees. I'm playing with 3 people. But unfortunately, I won't be receiving any prize for my gameplay. I'm unfortunately not that great. But that would make up the base of kind of where most players fall into the game of golf. You also have things that are player funded. So this would be something like a country club classic. And the way that works is every single player has a specific entry fee, and there are a limited number of players. So with that particular country club classic tournament, you have the entry fee being $200, you have 100 different players, and the prizes allot to a total prize pool of $8,000. And so you're kind of making sure that the top players are receiving the prizes, but all the funding comes from players in between. And then you have at the very top, you have kind of the fewest amount of players that are able to enter something like this, and this would be something like the US Open. So you have, believe it or not, you still have entry fees. After years and years of golf, the entry fees are not so high, so they're at $50. You have 156 players, but you have $9 million worth of prizes. So obviously, the entry fees are not making up for that total prize amount, but most things are subsidized by advertisers or other brand sponsors to make sure that you are giving some motivation for those top players within a sport to be able to compete for that total prize pool. And obviously, if you are a Tiger Woods or another excellent golfer, you're looking to really make a living off that. One of the key things to just look and think about this pyramid is this is the same way that many esports work. You have at the bottom a wide range of players that are competing potentially just for fun. There's no potential prize that they're going after. But you also have some that are really interested in entering for submitting an entry fee. and being able to win some amount of prizes based off the entry fees of all players that are in it. And then you're only really going to have a select few that fall into that top category, where they're sponsored by different brands, they're competing for a much larger prize pool, and they really represent sort of the professional players that are out there in the esport ecosystem. So a couple things about what you really need to have to ensure successful competition. One of the first kind of key things that we touched on a little bit is just making sure that gameplay is fair. There are a number of things that go into this, but a couple of kind of key things to highlight would be making sure that you're actively identifying and resolving any potential fraudulent activity. There's nobody who enjoys playing a game if they feel like they're being cheated. So making sure that there's no fraud in the system, that players know that the gameplay is fair is one of the key things of ensuring successful competition. And that really also plays into testing out fairness. So at Skillz, we have game developers do kind of a self-check on their fairness, and Kevin's going to jump into that a little bit later. And then we also have an algorithm for just ensuring that every game is fair and that players understand that they are playing within a fair ecosystem. And that third point of just sort of assuring that a player is competing in a game that is fair is key. Some of the minor features that we do just to ensure that is, we have a help center where players can talk to individuals if they feel like something wasn't particularly fair. They can also see a replay of their own game and see not only how do they play, but they can also look at their competitors so that they know this is how the game went down. This is why that competitor scored higher than I did. Other key things for ensuring successful competition is having the right genre and gameplay. One of the things that we just have really identified doesn't work well for having a highly competitive game is having something that's purely luck-based. So all games on the Skillz system are much more skills than luck. This is something that just shows in that you're really able to improve your skills and compete with one player against another player in something that really requires some level of skill, so that when you first start the game, your skill level may be at one level, but after playing it for 10 hours, your skill level is increasing, and after 100 hours, you're even better than you were at the 10-hour mark. And making sure gameplay is compatible with genre. I'm just going to touch on that briefly as Kevin is going to go into it in more detail, but whether you're playing different types of genres of games, you want to make sure that the gameplay is really matching the expectations of the audience within that particular genre. And then understanding whether cash or virtual currency enabled currencies are going to work for your audience. So this is based on wherever you're located or wherever your audience is located, are there cash enabled games allowed in that area? If you have players under the age of 18, you want to make sure that most things are only virtual, or you want to make sure that all games are only for virtual currency. And you also want to just hit on the audience demand. Some games work better for cash-enabled games, and players are really looking to put up sort of entry fees and compete for a cash prize. Other games, they're really much more looking just for high-engaging games and would prefer to compete for virtual currencies. So understanding kind of the audience demand within your market. So why is this all important? One of the things that we've identified is that there are 2.6 billion mobile gamers out there. That is an enormous amount of people that are playing games, are willing to play games on their phone. If you look at kind of rates amongst gamers for console or desktop, this definitely exceeds it. And so there's really an opportunity to tap into those 2.6 billion mobile gamers to create something in order to capture a large percentage of that market. And one of the other key things that we've identified is that 40% of people want to enter the competition. So if you're thinking about that 2.6 billion mobile gamers, we can roughly say that 40% of those would be willing to enter some sort of mobile competitive esport. It's just a very large number of people that are looking to find games that offer a competition and for them to enter into those competitive games. So we think it's a really cool area of the market to be in, and hopefully you guys will see that opportunity. And one of the things that we've also identified is that just competitive gamers, when it comes mobile competitive games, really serve an engaged or serve an underengaged or engaged and underserved audience. Competitive games monetize up to 6 times better than single-player games. So when you have that thrill of competing against another player, it's just something that is highly successful from a monetization perspective. And another thing that I love to kind of use as an analogy is that a lot of games that are not on sort of a competitive infrastructure have that potential of having extremely high engagement and kind of a short-lived game life cycle versus a competitive game. You're kind of consistently seeing players, the player base building over time. So players come in, they're engaging with the content of your game, and there's really kind of a network effect of growing that player base over time. So we see just generally sort of 2x longer single-player retention and engagement when it comes to playing mobile games. So what are some of the common challenges that developers face when trying to create an engaging and profitable game? One is that there's sort of that low engagement and retention rates with a high player acquisition cost. So getting players onto your game costs a lot of money. Getting them to stay on your game and engage with your game on a regular basis is difficult. It's a challenge that lots of game developers, no matter what type of game they're creating, often face. And games often lack a compelling player motivation, not necessarily in the gameplay experience, but what happens after that a game completes. So there isn't necessarily something where they can say, I'm competing against all these other players, here's where I stack up against all other players, and not offering that kind of sense of achievement is something that sometimes games are really lacking. And there's generally high maintenance costs for traditional monetization methods. For example, you can have a premium type of game where you're saying all gameplay after you pay for a certain amount of money is the upfront cost. That's something that you really are just having to scale the amount of players that are coming into your game. Or you can have something that is more of a traditional subscription or in-app purchases or advertisements. And there are definitely pros to that, but when it comes to either in-app purchases or advertising, that's something that kind of does both take away from the fairness of a game and it disrupts the player experience. So being able to provide something that doesn't rely on one of those monetization models is definitely a challenge. And it's expensive to develop and maintain technology for having that competitive infrastructure. We often see if a game developer is wanting to set up tournaments and make sure that all those tournaments are fair and that competitors understand they're playing in a fair tournament and they're doing prize fulfillment, there's a cost to that, and it's quite expensive. It's something that takes time to develop, and it takes resources to really maintain. So this is just another thing that we see as a common challenge to developers. And fairness and preventing cheating, that is a full-time job, making sure that you have some sort of customer support team that is looking into the different gameplays of players and ensuring that all games are fair, but also making sure that there's no fraudulent activity. This really requires kind of full-time staff, and this is often a large challenge for game developers if they're thinking about creating a competitive mobile game. So I'm going to give a quick plug just for Skillz here, but some of the things that we kind of make sure that we resolve for our game developers is one thing is that it's a seamless integration into your game of our SDK so that you can get up and running with that competitive multiplayer experience with relatively limited developer resources. Depending on how many resources you're kind of allocating to this effort, this can range anywhere from 5 days to a month or two, just depending on how long you have for downloading, integrating, testing, setting up competitive tournaments, and going live with the game. Kevin is going to talk through kind of what is that integration process in more detail, so I'll leave it at that for now. And this is something that really enhances your gameplay experience. Really, after a player finishes competing on your game, you want to make sure that they have a nice gameplay experience outside of the game. So being able to really see how am I competing in leaderboards. Am I able to participate in leagues against all players within that particular game? What is my general experience level or on a game and across all Skillz games? And being able to redeem tickets and spend tickets to purchase things in the store and redeem real-life prizes. All these things generally just enhance not only your game that you're playing, but or that you're developing, but also the overall gameplay experience of the player. And these things we've seen generally we're able to help boost user acquisition. There are 18 million players on the Skillz network. They're hungry for new games, so they're often checking out new games and organically coming to look into the games that you are going live with Skillz. And generally, we've seen that we have extremely high engagement and retention amongst our player base. So going back to kind of those quick hits of how you often see a mobile game, we're really in it for a long run. I have a British colleague here who often describes this as the Christmas tune effect of, you're able to come in and grow users and monetize off those users year after year, and that player base is growing and staying with you. And this is just a way of really being able to maximize existing monetization methods that uncover a new revenue stream. So this is a new kind of way of monetizing off your player base. If you have an existing player base or an existing game that you think would work well with the Skillz SDK, you can often offer them a different way of competing on our network and competing for real cash entry fees. And another kind of key point is that we're able to eliminate fraud and ensure fairness. On the fraud perspective, we have a full customer advocacy team that is specifically dedicated to detecting any potential fraud and resolving any issues there, so that and then eliminating any potential threat of fraud. And for fairness, we have a patented algorithm that just makes sure that all games are fair, that players understand they're competing in a fair environment, and this is just something that is kind of key and integral to what we're doing at Skillz. So those are a couple of just quick high-level benefits of the Skillz SDK and what you kind of can expect with going live with a Skillz-powered game. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin for a bit, who's going to talk about some of the key success rates for driving a competitive mobile game, and then is going to walk you through a little bit of the integration experience. So I'll turn it over to Kevin.
Thanks, Evan. So before diving into sort of the integration experience and how to bring your game onto the Skillz platform, I think it's important to highlight a couple of the key factors that drive initial success for your game. And those factors are the genre choice and fit for your game, the gameplay, whether it's fair, fun, and engaging, and finally the audience. You really need to know and understand deeply the core audience of your game. So the first thing I'm going to go into is genre, because this is something you want to think about before even necessarily deciding which game to bring on the platform. And also, it's kind of a trick question, because ultimately the genre of your game doesn't matter nearly as much as having clear, fair, and competitive gameplay for it, but there are some things to consider about the genre of your game while you're selecting it. So the first thing I want to sort of go over here is something Evan briefly touched upon earlier, that your gameplay really has to match your audience's genre or expectations for your game genre. And what I mean by that is more like, if you have a game that's listed as a bubble shooter game, for instance, and you can see the top left image, you've got bubbles on your collateral and whatnot, and so people are thinking, okay, this is a bubble shooter. But if a player jumps onto that game and starts playing it and turns out to be a first-person shooter where you're blowing bubbles at each other, it's going to be a little confusing for that player. So you really want to make sure that your gameplay is matching the expectation for the genre of that game to give a sort of like seamless and expected experience for your player. Next thing I want to go into is the content generation for your game. And one thing, as Evan mentioned earlier, that's really important is the fairness of the content, but also the replayability and the ability to generate engagement to make players come back and continue to play it. So you need to sort of keep in mind how your content will be generated for players when you're designing it for Skillz. And you can see we have a couple of examples of games listed up here. one of which is, Bubble Shooter Leagues, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, Guns, Cars, Zombies, and Pool Pro. All these games have different methods of generating content. For instance, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, they have a list of trivia questions, and so this content's all curated and selected. And the way to keep it engaging and interesting is to continue to add more and more questions to this pool so that, gamers don't just go and, memorize all the questions and, end up repeating things all the time. Pool Pro is kind of interesting because, it's a pool table, and players are going to be served the same content each time they play, but the players' choices and moves they make are what generates the dynamic experience, engaging experience. Another method is, for Guns, Cars, Zombies. This has a couple of maps that players can play on, and so, you get content that is, varied based on the map and some additional components to it, but, you get an engaging of experience in each one of these maps that players continue to keep wanting back and playing it. And finally, we have the bubble shooter example up here, where, you have rows of bubbles that come down as the player clears bubbles and, makes moves. But there's different ways that those bubbles can be served. For instance, like maybe, one way of doing this would be keeping, generating the entire field of bubbles before the game even starts. So both players are going to be served the same content, and based on literally before the match being decided. Another of which could be generating bubbles based on player interaction, where like say they pop a certain kind of bubble and it affects what bubbles come down in the next row. But either way, you need to make sure that both players are getting served the same content, and we actually have an awesome little tool to help out with making sure your players are getting served the same fair content that I'll go into later. That's our fairness tool in Skillz Random. The next thing I want to go over is gameplay. Now, things to remember about gameplay, you want to ask initially, and this is kind of standard for most games. Like, first of all, you want to ask, is this fun? Our players are going to want to play it. But one thing that's kind of unique to Skillz as a platform is you want the games also to be quick. And why you want it to be quick is the main method of monetization for a Skillz game is players playing tournaments and playing matches that they buy into. They play their entry fees. So if a player, can only play one game per hour because the game takes an hour, you're clearly not going to have as many games played as if your game takes about maybe a minute or a minute and a half per round. Additionally, you want to make sure this game is skill-based. Only games that are skill-based and fair can become cash-enabled. Another thing is engaging. Players want to come back and play it. And finally, is it competitive? Is it something that players will play and actually want to get better at and want to be the best at? Going along with the team competitive games, you want to make sure that it's something that players can pick up pretty easily. They go and they play their first game and feel that they have a degree of success the first time they play it, so they're not scared away, but also difficult to master. You want to give players the feeling that they're successful at the beginning, but there's a lot of room to grow and a lot of really high skill ceilings so that they can feel that when they are the best, they are actually the best at this game. And finally, the last thing I want to touch about gameplay is, whether, and this kind of goes also with a genre, you want to have a sort of unique quality to your gameplay, but still sort of like is representative of your genre or game as a whole and, represents the best parts of it. So, for instance, we have if you have a bubble shooter game, obviously you want the mechanics to be similar to a bubble shooter, but you want to have something that differentiates your game from the others in the genre. Something that players can play and instantly recognize as something that's great about your game that they aren't going to get in any other bubble shooter game. For instance, we have a specific example for this. It's a game that's on our platform called Cube, and a lot of you are probably familiar with the game of Tetris. You clear blocks by making rows and whatnot, but Cube has an awesome differentiating characteristic where you can see actually 3 blocks at a time. When you're going to clear rows. So instead of just having this sort of reactive, standard Tetris gameplay that goes down, you actually have this, interesting mechanic of deciding which pieces you want to put first and like stacking up your board in a way that adds a really high skill ceiling to it and makes the game have a very unique feel. The next thing I want to go over here, and the last of these like 3 key driving factors for success are attracting and growing the right audience. You can have the best game in the world, in terms of like mechanics and, it's really cool, but if no one's playing it, it won't be successful at the end of the day. So, creating an awesome game is one thing, but you really have to also keep in mind that to make it successful, you will need a user acquisition strategy. So one thing I'd really suggest, if you're a developer out there in the audience, you really want to be aligned with the needs and expectations of your user acquisition team if you have one, or your business team. You probably have a great idea of what kind of audience might enjoy your game and kind of what you're going for with it. So be clear to your business or user acquisition team. Have a conversation with them. Be like, this is how we made the game. This is who we think are going to be users that like it. And of course, on the other side, if you're the business team, go and have a conversation with the developers. Make sure everyone's clear. What the target of your game is. Throw around the ideas of who you might want to target, and build an actual strategy for growing your game's audience. And one thing to sort of keep in mind is if you're porting a game over, like an existing game that already has an audience, your Skillz game audience might not end up being the exact same group of individuals that played in your original game. It might appeal to some different people. So keep an open mind about it, and it's going to take a lot of strategy and a lot of research. But one good thing about that as well, if you're bringing over a game, is that you have the opportunity for cross-promotional traffic. And what I mean by that is, say you have your existing game and you want to bring it onto Skillz and make it competitive, you can actually run in-game advertising in your original game to try to pull over some users from that game and start populating your Skillz game. Now, this is something we talk about a lot at Skillz, this 100 DAU threshold for becoming cash-enabled. And this is because we have a fairness algorithm that runs at a certain number of games. So as a part of being a cash-enabled game on the Skillz platform, we have to be able to verify that your game is skill-based and fair. So you really want to keep driving and driving to get that traffic so that we can run the algorithm, certify it, and make your game cash-enabled. And finally, what I want to talk about with audience last, is if you're targeting users in a region, and this is something that Evan briefly spoke to before, you want to make sure that those users are within a cash-enabled region. Skill gaming isn't allowed in some places in the world, some states, so you want to make sure if you're targeting users that they are in a place that can become cash-enabled. All right, so keeping those key factors to test in mind when you're going about the initial plan for your game and planning and integrating are very crucial, and so once you've sort of built that strategy around that and you think you're ready to start integrating with Skillz, we have an awesome tool online on our developer console, which you can get to actually by going to our corporate site, corporate.skillz.com, and clicking on the developers tab, it'll bring you here. And we actually walk you through the whole process of putting the SDK into your game, and helping you configure how the tournaments and how your game or how Skillz looks in your game, and some other things like Apple Pay and other ways to help drive revenue and retention and whatnot. So some of you that have made games before on Skillz, or if you've potentially integrated with us before or used our developer console, might see that there's a bit of a change in this screenshot that we have up here. We're going to be releasing some awesome new features or a new change to our integration process on Dev Console. So I'll sort of walk through how this is going to look. There's actually 3 main steps now: integrating your game, configuring it, and publishing it. And integrating is where we'll be walking you through, this is how you put it into your game, this is where we verify fairness and whatnot. And then configuring is where we're going to be, doing the configuration options for how Skillz behaves in your game. You know what I mean? Like putting in, for a virtual currency game, defining what those virtual currency levels are, setting up Apple Pay, and deep linking and push notifications and whatnot. And then finally, we walk you through publishing your game and getting it live with Skillz. The first one I'm going to go into is integration. Now, we have a lot of extensive documentation online about how to, put Skillz in the code of your game and integrate it technically, so I'm not going to go too much into that. If you want more information on it, like I said, head to our developer site. We've got an awesome knowledge base there. What I really want to go to here is sort of the more strategic aspects of integration, how to turn your game, if it already exists, into a Skillz game. The first thing to sort of think of when you're bringing your game on the Skillz platform and you want to integrate it is you want to sort of distill down what the core elements of your game are and what is absolutely necessary. So a lot of games, you might have a lot of features and whatnot that aren't exactly a part of the core gameplay. And so you want to kind of think of what you can trim down and remove so you can really get the base elements of your game into Skillz for the competitive platform. Once you've figured out, what the base components are and trim down your game to that level, you'll have an opportunity to set up parameters using the SDK. And these parameters are things like telling Skillz what the scoring elements are, mechanics, goals, etc. It's basically a way to help link up your game to Skillz, and so we know how to set up tournaments and where, what sort of variables are needed when beginning games between players. Once you have all those set up, it's time to sort of test and tune your game. We recommend, not just immediately jumping in, going full-fledged, and based on your first initial ideas of what the game should be. We really think you should go and test and tune and figure out, what you can trim down more and do it as a sort of iterative cycle. Once you feel you're comfortable with, where your game's at, and you have it to a point where, your gameplay is good for Skillz, you want to think of sort of the first-time user experience for your users. You want to have a good tutorial for them so that you set them off right, and so they'll know actually how to play your game and how to be successful. Because nothing is more frustrating for a player than getting into a game and just having absolutely no idea what's going on. So having a good tutorial that just sets them off in the right direction is extremely valuable for retention. And finally, when a player has played a game and they get to the scoring screen that tells them how they did, we really suggest you put in a scoring screen for your game that comes before the skill scoring screen, one that kind of breaks down how they got the score they did and the various components of score, so that they can sort of gather what they did right and what they can improve on. So next, to go along with scoring, we need to make sure that your game is fair, right? We've touched on this a lot during this presentation. Fairness is the core element of skill-based gaming. And if you see on the side here, we have a demonstration of, if a game isn't fair, it isn't going to be fun, and it isn't going to be competitive. Imagine a basketball game without referees or a rule book, right? It wouldn't be that much fun to play or watch if it wasn't a fair game. Imagine if one team came on with 2 people and the other one had 50. It's not fair, it's not competitive. Another thing to note is that if your game isn't fair, it won't be eligible for cash enablement. So it's extremely important that we make sure your game is fair, and we actually give some tools to help ensure that your game is fair, particularly in regards to if there's any elements of random number generation in your game. We have a we have a random quote randomization algorithm that what it does is it simulates RNG, but it'll give both players the same numbers so that you can ensure that if there is a random element to your game, both players are getting the same random elements. When you think that your game, is fair, you've run some tests on it, you're getting the same results for each player, we actually have a fairness tool built into our integration process in the dev console, so we can help you verify that your game is fair. And finally, when your game's live, we'll be there for you. We'll be tracking live games and running our fairness algorithm in the background. And so if we detect any issues, we'll reach out and let you know, if we see some of that. Next thing I want to talk about here is tournaments. Part of the integration process in Dev Console is to configure how tournaments are named and behave within your game. This is actually where you can put in game parameters to make it so that various tournament levels can affect actually components of gameplay, such as time that you give a player. Say you want to give a player that's in a 50 virtual currency match versus a 1 virtual currency match. Maybe you want to give the 50 some extra time, or maybe you want to make it a little harder, something like that. This is where you'll actually be able to configure that. We want to note, though, that there is a default set of Skillz tournaments, and while you can change them, we really do suggest that at least for your first game you stick to this, because we've tested them a lot and we've found that they've been very successful within our games. One last thing to note is cash tournaments won't necessarily go live they won't go live on the initial launch of your game. So even though you can configure cash tournaments here, they won't necessarily be live when you launch. Your game has to pass the Skillz fairness algorithm first. So now you've configured your tournaments, your game is fair, you've integrated, etc. It'll be time to actually take your game live. Now, we have a little checklist of things to do before taking your game live, and this is things like, finalizing your tournament names or parameters, making sure your custom theme is skinned and ready to be integrated in your game project, making sure push notifications and Apple Pay are working, basically little last-minute checks to make sure everything is set up right. Once you're good, you've verified everything is working, then it's time to, make your final production build and upload it to our servers. And then, once it's all uploaded, integrated in the Skillz system, and you've gone live, we really recommend that you actually go through the first-time user experience with it. Like get on a phone, make a new account, change your name, change your profile pic, just do some last-minute checks to make sure everything is working as anticipated. And then, if you choose to go live to a specific targeted audience instead of, launching out as a full launch initially, recommend putting some, thought into who you want to launch it to, and try to pick an audience that is as similar as possible to your main audience, so you get a good feel of how users are feeling about it, and make sure that feel is representative of your audience as a whole. So now, you've launched your game, you've got everything up and running. There's a few things to think of, after your game is live and launched. One thing to note is that, when we talk about user acquisition, it's not just the number of installs. It's the number of installs within a time interval. If you get 1 million installs over 10 years, it's a lot different than getting 1 million installs over, 10 days, right? Skillz, we drive home this user acquisition thing, and obviously it's important with every game, but particularly with Skillz, we need a lot of daily active users to match players together. If you have a big player base, it's going to be a lot easier for players to find competitors at a similar skill level. And as time goes on, don't feel that you have to always keep your tournaments exactly the same. We actually suggest sort of once the DAU is rolling in and things are doing good, that's when you can sort of fine-tune your tournaments and figure out if things work better or don't work as well for your game. But keep in mind that if you do make changes to your game, you really don't want to break fairness. It's going to cause issues, so just make sure that you're checking in whenever you make a change to your game that the game is still fair. And you'll probably need to do some live updates to your game. The game you roll out initially probably will be very different than the game that ultimately gets market fit and is successful. So don't feel bad if you have to go back to the drawing board and make changes, because it's something that happens in most games. And finally, you have to be aware that there's a lot of features in the Skillz ecosystem in the Skillz SDK, but not all of them will be initially available to your game. Some of them, really don't work unless we have a high DAU, like brackets or live fence or stuff like that. So just know you may see some things in other games that aren't available initially in your game, but as your game becomes more and more successful, you'll reach those milestones and we'll open up those features for you. So to summarize everything I've talked about so far, when you're planning to bring your game on Skillz, you want to think of the genre and the gameplay and audience, and when you're integrating, the really big things to think of are, how you're integrating it, making sure it's fair, tuning your tournaments, and our go-live checklists. So I'm going to turn it over to Evan now, and he's going to talk a little bit about some success stories of one of our partners that has gone on Skillz from a self-service model.
Cool. Thanks, Kevin. Well, picking it up from where Kevin left off, I do want to talk just quickly about one of our studios that came to us a number of years ago as an independent game studio. They had 2 game developers initially and have now launched a number of high DAU cash-enabled games and have been really successful, so much so that they've transitioned their business model into solely producing Skillz games. And that's Tedlar Studios. They have a number of different games with us, including Solitaire Cube and Cube, and they've seen a lot of great results with us in terms of both the amount of ARPDAU that they have. You can see 68-cent ARPDAU with just 2 cents before Skillz implementation. Their retention rates on a number of their games have been really great. So when they bring on new players, they're really able to retain them. They keep on coming back, and the engagement within those games is great. And as I alluded to at one point earlier in this presentation, one of the things that we've just seen is that their games have been live, some of their games have been live for a number of years now, and the DAU just keeps on going up. So it's really kind of creating that game, going live with a launch, growing initial user base, and now they're really seeing a bit of a network effect where users are organically coming to to play their game, and they're retained, and they're checking out other Skillz-powered Tether games. So it's just been an amazing kind of success story. If you do want to learn more about Tether, I do recommend checking out our blog. There's a success story about how they implemented Skillz and what their results have been since coming on to us. So I do want to get to some questions. Notice a number of them have come in. Feel free to, if you do have a question that you haven't been asked because you're a little shy, no worries, do put it into the chat box. But before getting there, I do want to just take a quick poll on the audience and hear about if you would like to learn more about Skillz can help monetize your game. So we'll just give you guys a couple minutes there to input things into the poll, and then we'll move over to our Q&A session. Awesome. So sorry, I noticed a couple people were still answering as I flipped over, but I can see that a large number of you do want to learn more about Skillz, so we will make sure that somebody that will be following up with you guys in email, and hopefully we'll be sending some information that will help you guys make a decision on what we can do to help you guys monetize your game. So thank you for that, and we're going to jump into Q&A now. I can see that a number of you guys have submitted questions. Please feel free to continue submitting questions. We'll try and get to as many as possible over the next 10 minutes. So one question from Christopher that I can see is, he said, does Skillz have demographic data on players that compete in Skillz cash and virtual currency tournaments? Can we use that data to identify our target market? It's an excellent question, Christopher. We do have general Skillz demographic data that you would be able to find in some of our press releases. Check out corp.skillz.com. There are a number of different press releases on that and articles saying, which states have cash-enabled gameplay allowed, which ones do not. But generally, my recommendation there is that you would have to understand for your specific game, where is your audience based, and you still would need to be able to do a little bit of identification of who your target market is, and whether your game would work within that market. So although we can give you some kind of overarching guiding principles, there would still need to be some discovery that you would have to do on your own. Cool. Let's look into a couple of other questions. Serve Hermans, just for my understanding, when a game goes live, there's no revenue for the developer until a certain amount of DAO is achieved and players are starting to play for cash. Is that correct? Yes, Serve, that is correct. So when we do have a game going live, we want to make sure that that game is fair, 100% fair, and that our fairness algorithm can check out that game. So that requirement is at about 100 DAO, or is at 100 DAO. So during that point, you just want to make sure that you're trying to drive as many new players to the game as possible, that they're engaged with the game, so that you can really hit that 100 DAO threshold. Once you hit that threshold, then we're able to make sure that your game is cash enabled, and that's where the monetization really comes off.
All right, so we have a question here from Dwayne. I have a turn-based multiplayer game. Do I need to cut it over to your multiplayer network, or will it play well with Photon? So we really recommend for all Skillz-based games, or Skillz-enabled games, that you play over our multiplayer network. All of our, basically it's one of our main offerings for this platform is, we handle all the multiplayer facilitation, all that kind of stuff. So we really recommend you stick to our network when you integrate a game with Skillz.
Cool, and Grant Ricketts asked a question of, you could highlight a few games or examples that are working well. We have a number of different genres that work well. Some of them, I would say, within sort of we have Bubble Shooter, which is kind of a game where you're trying to strategically pop bubbles. We have a number of different card-based games that work well. Solitaire is a particularly successful genre within the Skillz system. But we also have a lot of different types of games. So we have Guns, Cards, and Zombies, which is a driving, how would you describe that, Kevin? It's a driving...
It's an endless runner game.
Endless runner game that is extremely fun. I definitely recommend checking out. It has a lot of cool, engaging content. But the main point I kind of want to leave with you, Grant, is that there are a number of different types of games and different types of genres that work well within the Skillz ecosystem. It's really about just kind of creating a gameplay that is engaging and is kind of along the shorter route of overall game and allows for solid player competition, one player against another. Cool. Awesome. So another question from Mike we have is, if my Skillz game becomes particularly successful, would Skillz be open to having a closer partnership with my studio? Excellent question, Mike. So generally the way that we work is you kind of do everything that Kevin talked about in the integration. You head to the developer site, you sign up for a developer console account, you integrate it, you set up your tournaments, you go live. The first major threshold that we would love to see and hope for you guys to all see is becoming cash enabled at that 100 DAO marker. And then we have a number of resources that we offer in terms of really trying to help drive up that DAO. So there are a number of different ways to do so. We are trying to get as many Skillz players that are playing different Skillz games onto your Skillz game. And then as you move up those kind of DAO thresholds, engagement thresholds, retention thresholds, eventually you would be moved over to being a managed account. So you would have an account manager or CSM that is really trying to drive, from a strategic perspective, how can you continue the success of your game.
Awesome. So the next question we have is from Laura. Will we have to monitor and report on metrics such as DAU myself, or does Skillz have a way to help keep track of those numbers? Great question. So we actually have an analytics dashboard on the developer console where we actually help you keep track of the DAO and actually track some awesome skill-specific things like the behavior of your cash players and whatnot. So we have an awesome suite of ways to help you measure how your game's performing and whatnot, and it's all included in the service.
Okay, so we have another one, let's see, from John. Where can I learn more about having the SDK integrated into my game? Check out developers.
It's developers.skillz.com. We have a massive library of documentation that basically gets you every step of the way through the integration process. We have videos, really anything that you need to help get your game on the Skillz platform, we have in our documentation hub. All you got to do is just go to developerskillz.com, log in, and then you click on the documentation link in the top bar.
Cool. And there's a question from Lily on how would you suggest that a game developer and a UA team coordinate to effectively drive traffic to your game? Kevin touched on this a little bit, but generally, especially if you're a smaller independent studio, you may not have a resource that is dedicated to UA. You may be a game developer and needing to do UA yourself. I would recommend checking out our last webinar, which is how to drive a successful UA strategy, if that is the case, on a low cost budget. But generally speaking, it's making sure that your gameplay is matching up to the audience that you want to drive. So if you are a game developer, it's really coordinating with your UA team when you're thinking about going live and saying, this is the type of audience that I believe would be interested in playing this type of game, and then passing it over to the UA team so that they're really able to focus on targeting and acquiring users that fit within that audience paradigm. They're eventually probably going to learn more if they're a dedicated UA team on honing in who is that exact target demographic. But that initial launch is really, really critical for any sort of kind of independent studio game developer. And then again, if you're on the UA side, it's making sure that you're taking the time out to go speak with the game developer and get all of that information so that you're able to define a successful UA strategy. Cool, and I have another question from Dan. For a studio that has never made a Skillz game before, would you recommend converting an existing game or creating a new game specifically for Skillz? We've seen success with both. So there are a number of games that have their main SKU and have then developed a Skillz-based game because they don't want to take away all of their players from their main SKU and put them into a Skillz game, but they have identified a certain portion of the audience that would like to compete for, either a cash-based tournament or a virtual currency tournament. And we have other game developers that have really come to us and wanted to launch just a completely new game. So I would say both we have seen, but hopefully you will choose to do one of those, Dan. So thanks for that question. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much. That is probably all the time that we have for questions. If there isn't a question that we got to, we'll try and make sure to follow up with the recording to some of those answers. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to come out and listen to us. Remember, you can head to developers.skillz.com, or you can write an email to launch@skillzdev.com to learn more. Thank you once again, and hope to see you guys on next webinar. Have a great day.